Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Claudia Kremers, and I'm a research fellow international ocean governance at IDDRI. And I would like to welcome you today to the conference on next generation multilateralism, planetary governance for sustainable recovery. This conference is co-organized by IDDRI and the European Chair on Sustainable Development of Sciences Po Paris. There have been many calls the last 2 days for more inclusiveness. This session that you just joined is making multilateralism really inclusive, learning from recent concrete advances. And we'll look into the question of social and political inclusiveness in a multilateral context. There will be 3 other sessions that you can join today, and you can look on the website and scroll through to see which sessions would be of interest to you. We're available if you have any technical questions at all, or if you have problems joining a session. Also from the technical side, if you would like to ask any questions at all, you can use the Q&A button on the right of your screen. Behind the scenes, we will screen and select the questions, and at the end of the sessions, we will address your questions. I would now like to hand the floor to Professor Elisa Morguera, who is going to chair the session. She's a professor of global environmental law at the University of Strathclyde Law School in Glasgow, and has focused her research on the role of international human rights standards and processes to support transformative change with a view to leaving no one behind. I think it's the perfect introduction to the session on inclusivity. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and it's been really an honor, and they accepted with trepidation to have this discussion today around inclusivity and multilateralism. We have an amazing panel and really important and diverse perspectives from which we can learn and have a very nourishing discussion on this topic. What we will focus on in the panel is really reflecting on what leave no one behind means, and what we have learned about not being able to achieve that vision, and what we have learned that may help us progress along that road. And really as a key element that underpins every single element of Agenda 2030 and every single Sustainable Development Goals. We will reflect on social and political inclusiveness. I think we also need to reflect around cultural inclusiveness, different systems of knowledge, and how they can contribute to our own understanding of what is vulnerability, what is inequity and inequality, and how we can find appropriate answers and transformative answers to those questions that are also in line with the capacity of our planet to support our well-being. As Claudia kindly mentioned, I have been more and more interested in the role of international human rights, although my background is international environmental law, and I've really been interested in how, from a legal but also a strategic perspective, the relationships between international human rights law and the environment can help both inclusiveness more broadly conceived, the participation of broader public, but also particular sectors of civil society and particular groups in key decisions that affect their lives in more direct and indirect ways, but also how we can use that lens to really understand who's not been seen and heard or understood as relevant in particular discussions. And while, of course, in our discussion, we will be very critical also around the role of human rights and international human rights law and institutions, and thinking about well-known criticism about whether they may be too idealistic or too political, I think it is important to look at the full potential of human rights and how they can be used in even more creative ways to help us understand who might or who has been left behind, for how long and for what reasons, and what else we can do to address the situation. So I just wish to share in a couple of minutes a few of the things I've been recently involved as director of the One Ocean Hub. This is a global research coalition from the UK, but also involving colleagues in South Africa, Namibia, and Ghana, as well as the regional universities in the Caribbean and the South Pacific. And what we've tried to do is look at the relationship between human rights and the marine environment, which is less understood than the relationship between human rights and the terrestrial environment, with a view to understand who are the subjects that are vulnerable, who are the groups that have been historically marginalized from decisions, and how are these decisions taken in a way that contribute to leave people behind. And what has been quite interesting in this research collaboration is, first of all, that we're trying to integrate as much as possible social and marine sciences with a view to show that the standards emerging at the nexus of international human rights law and international law of the sea and international environmental law make sense from a scientific perspective, from a very broad scientific perspective, and in fact give further legitimacy to those cutting-edge scientific findings in showing how we need to be aware of vulnerabilities, the time scale, the other scales that may come into play. But at the same time, we're also looking at how in integrating the science base, we need to find new ways, new approaches, and build, I think, new capacities among researchers to engage fairly and respectfully and constructively with other holders of other knowledge systems. And looking at the very kind of nitty-gritty specific tools that we use in the decisions, for instance, on the marine environment, from modeling to quota allocations, to really see how we can bring all that richness of the broad range of sciences and different systems of knowledge to the effect of leaving no one behind once we take decisions. And one really interesting aspect has been the involvement of the arts and how we can use art-based research approaches as a way to bring that knowledge together, but also create an experience where decision makers, business representatives, and others who have been maybe at loggerheads in trying to find a way not to leave somebody behind, to find a more open space for learning from each other. And I think that's maybe the last thought I want to give in terms of opening our panel, which is how we can look at ways that have worked for us to learn more across scales, across sectors of society, across sectors of research, because it's really the learning that is, I think, the potential for the transformative change that we need. And one of the things we've also, we're experimenting in the One Ocean Hub is trying to connect through research the local level and the international level. The communities who are struggling to get a view, to get a say in decisions, environmental human rights defenders, and in a direct contact with the United Nations, with a view to understand what are the arguments, but also the mechanisms and the opportunities to work with national governments in slightly different ways than the ones that have been experienced at the national local level. And equally for the UN to experiment with new approaches in really having that more direct and transformative connection and understanding of realities on the ground. And so I think one of the insights that has emerged about how we can foster learning is really taking seriously mutual capacity building across scale, across holders of different kinds of knowledge, and how that focus, the real genuine focus on capacity, may help us to understand who's been left behind and why, and what we've been losing by leaving people and communities and knowledge systems behind, and how we can devise together, co-develop approaches moving forward. So I hope this is a helpful introduction for a very rich and complicated discussion. And without further ado, I would like to give the floor to our first panelist, Professor Olivier de Schutter, who is currently UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Extreme Poverty, but have also served as Special Rapporteur on the human right to food. And we expect him to offer his insights based on the experiences around the human rights-based approach more generally, and maybe particularly the role of the right to food. So without further ado, Olivier, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Elisa, and very warm welcome to the co-panelists and those who are with us this morning, this afternoon. Let me preface my remarks by saying that I think this event on how to make multilateralism truly inclusive comes at a very appropriate time. Indeed, I believe we are now at a critical point in which we are witnessing three important shifts in how we think about multilateralism. The first shift I would like to highlight is a shift from state-centered multilateralism to the emergence of transnational civil society and the growing role of domestic actors, including courts, in ensuring compliance with the commitments that governments make at international level. For many years, we have thought of international relations as essentially relations between states represented by the executives, the governments. But now it is high time we open up this black box of states and understand that sub-national actors, the courts, NGOs, have a major role to play in shaping multilateralism. That is most easy to identify if we look at the question of compliance. In traditional international law and international relations, compliance is based on the reactions that states have when one state does not comply with its obligations. It is based on peer pressure, on reciprocity, on, in worst cases, the adoption by one state of countermeasures to force another state to comply. And indeed, even in the discussions launched by the book of Abram Chase and Antonia Chase, The New Sovereignty, where the reputation of a state is what guides its compliance with international law, even there, what really matters to the state is the reactions of other states. Today, we are in a very different world in which the reality is that compliance with international commitments is really the result of pressure from below, from civil society, from courts, based on the internalization or domestication, one might say, of international norms by those actors within states. And those actors may be national human rights institutions, they may be NGOs, they may be courts. That is very clear in the area of human rights, where courts have increasingly been forcing governments to comply with their international commitments, even in the absence of the reaction of other states. But it's also true in the area of climate change, where we have now a growing tendency to have climate change litigation in which domestic courts force governments to deliver on their commitments, to take seriously the statements they made in international fora or under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, for example. Moreover, we have also a situation in which increasingly non-state actors, corporations in particular, are now directly targeted by judicial proceedings, as we've seen, for example, in this spectacular case against Royal Dutch Shell before the Dutch courts, and the judgment of 26th of May of this year of the Hague District Court, forcing Shell to reduce by 45% its emissions of carbon dioxide by the year 2030 in comparison to the levels of 2019. So that's the first evolution from multilateralism as the result of states interacting with one another to a form of multilateralism in which non-state actors, including courts in particular, play a major role to discipline states to ensure that they deliver on the development goals or the sustainable development goals in this context that they have pledged to seek to pursue. The second shift is from a dichotomy between, on the one hand, multilateralism and, on the other hand, nationalism and protectionism, to a much more subtle third way, which I would like to refer to as a multilateralism of the ends. By this, I mean that states or regions such as the EU take action unilaterally in order to compensate for the deficits of multilateralism, for the difficulty of achieving agreement across all the UN member states, the full 196 member states of the UN. But states take action unilaterally, not to serve their selfish interests, but rather to support or to contribute to globally agreed objectives such as the Sustainable Development Goals. And we could discuss this at length, but I will give just one example of what I mean by this multilateralism of the ends. And that is the proposal by the European Commission made in July 2021 to adopt a carbon border adjustment mechanism, a carbon tax at the borders of the EU, essentially to ensure that the burdens faced by European businesses in certain sectors shall also have to be shouldered by the companies exporting to the EU in the sectors covered under the European emissions trading scheme. Now, the CBAM, the carbon border mechanism, may be seen at first glance as a protectionist move, right? The EU seeks to protect its producers, its domestic firms from unfair competition from abroad by imposing on companies who wish to export to the EU certain taxes to compensate for the fact that in their home country, they are not under similar obligations as companies doing business in the EU. Now, it can be seen thus, but it can also be seen as the EU putting its weight, roughly 19 or 20% of the global GDP, behind a form of globalization that is much more supportive of the global development agenda and the sustainable development agenda in particular. Imagine, for example, that the money collected through this carbon border adjustment mechanism is not pocketed by the EU member states, but rather re-injected in development projects and supporting countries from the global south to make their ecological transition. That could allow to send a very strong and positive message to our trading partners in the global south in particular, that they will be rewarded if they shift to a greener economy, to cleaner production processes by having facilitated the access to European markets. And that is a unilateral move by the EU, of course, but supporting the SDGs and supporting a much more humane and sustainable form of globalization. So that is, I think, the second shift we see. It's not purely a choice to be made between multilateral agreements in which everyone can join or protectionism. It is putting the weight of each actor on the international scene in the service of globally agreed goals in order to give teeth to these goals and to make sure that these collectively agreed objectives in the area of sustainable development and human rights are effectively attained. And the same could be said for any conditionality attached to trade agreements, for example, in the area of human rights. And the third shift we see is perhaps most closely connected, Elisa, to your opening remarks. It is a shift to rights-based approaches to the achievement of globally agreed objectives, such as the Sustainable Development Goals. In accordance with the Leave No One Behind slogan, increasingly, we seek to ensure that policymaking serves all people without discrimination, and basing the search for sustainable development on human rights is the best way to do this. And the best example of this is the reactions to the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic and social crisis that this resulted in which a large number of states adopted social protection measures to cushion the shock for the population. And most of these measures consisted in cash transfer systems, very often improvised, ad hoc, short-term, protecting only some portions of the population because states were caught unprepared and because in many cases, social protection schemes in place were certainly far from covering all the population. And I could, of course, give figures and examples. The situation of Africa is particularly telling in this regard, in which only 17.4% of the African population has some form of social protection, and the vast majority have no social protection at all. Only 5% of unemployed in Africa, for example, have unemployment benefits. Now, what is really quite striking is that those improvised reactions of states often did not cover everyone because they were conceived of as charity-based measures in which the states, in a quasi-humanitarian gesture, sought to protect the population from the economic crisis, to protect workers losing their jobs, or to protect families deprived of their revenues. But very often those measures were not conceived in a rights-based perspective. However, there is now a very strong push to ensure that those measures that have been adopted and improvised in response to the crisis will be made permanent, based on the idea that there is a human right to social security under Article 9 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and that would be consistent with the pledges made in the recommendation number 202 on social protection floors, adopted unanimously at the International Labour Conference in June 2012. What does this mean? This means that social protection should be defined as legal entitlements that people may claim against governments, that the beneficiaries should be clearly defined and the entitlements clearly defined so that they may be claimed, that the beneficiaries should be adequately informed about the rights they can exercise, and that they have access to independent complaints mechanisms if they are denied the child allowances, the unemployment benefits, the kind of support that the state has pledged to provide. What difference would this make? Well, it would make a major difference by transforming the relationship between the service providers and the state services on the one hand, and the beneficiaries of social protection on the other hand, who will be empowered and will be not ashamed of claiming their rights, but instead encouraged to claim from the government that it delivers on those commitments it made, and that it respects its promises. This can significantly reduce the non-take-up of rights. In other terms, the phenomenon, the widespread phenomenon under which people do not claim the benefits they normally should be entitled to because they are poorly informed, because they are ashamed, because they fear stigmatization or even institutional abuse if they claim their rights. So that would be a first positive consequence of adopting a rights-based approach to social protection. Secondly, it would avoid discrimination. In many countries, entered in a report Human Rights Watch just published on Kenya, Nigeria, Cameroon, Ghana, and Uganda, and their reactions to the crisis, we see in many cases governments using social protection as a political tool to help certain families, to help certain ethnic groups, to help certain politically loyal people, but discriminating against the others. And a rights-based approach is a way to avoid that kind of distortion in the way people are supported by the state. Thirdly, and finally, grounding the social protection response against the crisis in human rights is a way to avoid or at least reduce the risk of corruption. And we know that in a number of countries, the reason why people in poverty do not have access to support from the state in the form of social protection is because they have to pay a small bribe to the service provider to have access to unemployment benefit or medical care or to support in other forms, and that makes it that results in a paradoxical situation. The social programs benefit large chunks of the population, except those in poverty who cannot afford to pay that bribe and who therefore remain excluded. So for all these reasons, there's now a very strong push to say protecting the livelihoods of the population can only be done effectively if this response is grounded in human rights, and this has a series of implications at the different levels that I mentioned. So this is what I would like to open with. Multilateralism, not only based anymore on interstate relations, but involving non-state actors, number one. Number two, multilateralism promoted by countries and regions through unilateral measures that seek to encourage a form of sustainable development, even in the absence of robust multilateral agreements at global level. And thirdly, an approach to sustainable development that is grounded in human rights to ensure, indeed, that no one is left behind. Many thanks.
Very much, Olivier, and I'm sure the next speakers will also come back to some of the themes you've already highlighted. So I would like to pass now the floor to Dr. Mariama Williams, a Senior Program Officer in Global Governance for Development Program at the South Center. And Mariama will offer us a perspective focused on gender equality and women empowerment.
Yes, good morning. I'm here with you, and thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this discussion. When I was approached to speak or participate in this panel, I was asked to talk about some of the issues that relate to people in the informal economy and also that touch on migration. But the theme of the panel, making multilateralism really inclusive, learning from recent concrete advances. I was thinking to myself to say there's a bit of challenges here. That first of all, especially when you look at the last part of the theme, for me, I don't really see any real advancements, but a continuation on a trajectory that is based on a global governance architecture which is not inclusive, and in fact it is old, and it was built to meet the needs of only a few countries in the international system. But if there's anything that anyone is going to remember, if you forget everything that I'm going to say today, I'd just like you to remember that the one point that I wish to make is that policies that are designed at the multilateral and even at national levels restrict and constrain or frustrate the efforts of ordinary people. And in many cases, these also include startups and small and medium scale enterprises. So these efforts they have to make livelihoods are usually frustrated or they are constrained. But 3 points really that I want to make to advance this point that I'm making. First of all, the fact that discussion of multilateralism generally tends to focus on trade. And this is understandable, of course, because this relates to the economy. But there is more to the economy than trade. And this can be seen in some of the climate-related problems which the world is facing today. I hope this will become clear to see, and everybody will see that these are all-rounded and connected issues and have impacts on groups and people who are considered to be excluded as I proceed in my presentation. So we can talk, for example, about biodiversity loss and pollution. Normally, when you talk about resource extraction, for example, for trade, for purposes of trade, this contributes to about 90% of biodiversity loss. Trade itself sees the flow of waste to countries that cannot deal with the waste. So we have, for example, e-waste, which goes to countries that are not able to handle that kind of waste. We have plastic pollution. We even have greenhouse emissions that are associated with shipping during the conduct of trade. All of this has impacts on people on the ground, as I hope to illustrate shortly. After the second point, which I wish to make, that some of the problems of multilateralism I have highlighted actually become more pronounced when considered in the context of the relationship between the EU, for example, and Africa. And my second point really is that the interests of various actors in the multilateral system, and particularly of the EU and Africa, in EU-Africa relations seem to be at variance. Now, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with this. I mean, those of you who may be, for example, political scientists will know that in the realist tradition, countries and also groups of countries have these realist interests to protect. So there's nothing fundamentally wrong with that. But the parties here, nowadays they call them the partners, the EU and Africa, for example. They talk past each other and they do not talk to each other. And in fact, the EU has historically and generally tends to talk down on African countries. This can be seen in issues like migration, for example. So migration is prominent. When you look at EU-Africa relationships and even the dialogues that they have, you will find that migration is very prominent there. But this is usually, it seems to be unidirectional, and it is never framed as migration from EU or European countries to Africa, but it is migration which is undesirable from Africa to the EU or its member countries. So, and also now the way in which the EU and Africa therefore respectively view migration is different. Africa generally, and if you look at, for example, some of the treaties of the African Union, it tends to view migration in the context of development. They speak of the development, migration development nexus. But on the side of the EU, migration is a security issue. So there's that variance. And this leads me to my third and last point, which is bad EU policies. The economic, and since I'm talking about migration, the economic circumstances that will compel Africans to migrate are aggravated by the negative impact of EU policies. And two cases in point before I just conclude or finish are the EU Common Fisheries Policy and the Common Agricultural Policy. And these, when you look at these, you see that these are actually decades-old problems. And that's why I'm saying that I don't really see any concrete advancements when you talk about the multilateral. I won't even talk about the stalled Doha round, Doha round and everything else. But you see these problems that have persisted and where countries have reached deadlocks and they can't move past that. That's the reason why I made that point in the first place. But the fisheries policy has had a negative impact on the fisheries industries in West Africa, for example. So you see, for example, that most of the agreements the EU has with African countries which have sizable fishing industries in Africa's central and western coast, these are stacked against African countries. But also problematic are the subsidies that are paid to EU commercial farmers, or rather commercial fishermen, before I talk about the farmers. So these include those who are actually guilty of conducting illegal fishing. Not only are small time and subsistence fishermen in West Africa unable to compete, their fishing stocks are depleted for European consumers. So you will see that livelihoods are destroyed. Their food security and marine ecosystems are eroded. And actually we see then in this that countries that are not responsible for the state of the oceans end up suffering for the actions of others. And then of course there's the issue of subsidies of that are paid to EU farmers under its agricultural policy. These will hurt African farmers, and they in Africa, they distort markets, they undercut farmers, they reduce their productivity or competitive capabilities, and this actually has an impact of affecting entire livelihoods and life. There's no time for me to talk about, for example, in the trade area, the issue of the economic partnership agreements, which generally civil society in Africa is agreed to say these have been imposed on African countries, and African countries have been forced to sign or enter into these agreements, but they have the impact of distorting regional integration on the continent and other effects. I think I'll end there. I won't make any conclusions. We can discuss further in the question and answer session. Thank you so much for listening.
Very much, Chris, and for how much I'm sorry of Mariama's technical difficulties. It has probably been really good to hear your views right after Olivier and provide that critical perspective on not just the EU, but I think all other unilateral, bilateral, and minilateral efforts to pursue sustainable goals and other international objectives, but at the same time, taking into account both foreseeable and unforeseeable impacts, which may be either on, as you were saying, other regional integration efforts, but also other priorities in Africa and other regions, and ultimately also potentially human rights impacts. And this is something that the EU has examined over time in other, for instance, let's call them minilateral initiatives, such as the forest law enforcement and governance approach. And certainly this is a really interesting area for us to discuss once we open the floor for discussion and questions. But I think that the other point that you made around what are the focus of discussions at the multilateral level and who's left behind in terms also the interests of small and medium enterprises, really interesting one. So I hope that we'll have time to expand on those. But let's see, Mariama, if your technical issues have been resolved, it'd be great to hear from you.
Okay.
I see your mic is on. Is your video, can your video be on as well?
Yeah, I don't know what's going on with my video.
Okay.
On. So I'm going to try to switch. I have two things going on. Let's see if I can switch to my laptop, if that's better. Can you hear me? Can you see me and hear me now?
Yes, we can do both. Yeah, great, thanks.
All right, so let me get out of here. Okay, I'm now on the laptop and you can hear me, right? And you can see me.
Yes, there's a bit of an echo. Maybe, sorry, you may need to switch off the audio on one of the two devices.
All right, so good morning, everyone. I'm sorry, I seem to have technical problems either with the video or the mic, but at least I think you can hear me now. All right, so first I would like to start with a disclaimer. I'm sorry, but it should have been corrected. I am not with the South Center. So I'm not speaking as a representative of the South Center or a staff of the South Center. I'm with the Institute for Law and Economics in Jamaica, as well as the Integrated Policy Research Institute. And I'm a senior associate with DAWN, Development Alternative with Women for a New Era. So thank you very much. It's been a very interesting panel so far. I enjoyed the intervention by Professor Schutter, as well as the last panelist, Mr. Nishimbe. I have a few remarks. I think I will restrict myself to a narrow perspective, which is to focus a lot on what I think is, I agree that we need to do multilateralism from the top down, as predominantly and spectacularly failed in the contemporary period. It's failing to inspire, it no longer inspire confidence in many populations, both North and South. And I think a lot of that is due to the failure of global governance and multilateralism to deliver on the promises made to ensure social stability, sustainability, and economic security. And I think we're in an era where far too many people, men, women, children, are witnessing and experiencing these phenomena that are destroying their lives. On the pandemic, this preceded the pandemic. The pandemic has only worsened and exacerbated that. So that's my first point. I think for us to move, we have to rethink multilateralism and global governance. And we also have to include the added dimension that Professor Schutter mentioned, which is the micro and the meso dimension. Globalization, multilateralism that is inspired and consultative and inclusive from the bottom up. All right. So it's two-part. I think the COVID crisis in the work has done what I think both Richard Reeves and Isabel Sawhill argue is like the flash of an X-ray, the pandemic exposed the deep fractures in our society: race, class, gender, economic status. And it really opened up the fragility of finance, poor health, precarious employment, and what we in feminists have talked about many, many years, for years, decades, care economy, which is, and many of the dimensions of the care economy, which are what are also were identified during the pandemic as essential work. And also it showed that women's attachment to the labor force was very fragile in many cases. If we look at what's happening during the pandemic, many women are losing the labor force participation. They're having to go back into the home for social reproduction, for taking care of children, with school clothes and so forth. So you see when you look at the statistics, you'll see that's going on. So I think that the other quote that I really want to put on is that the pandemic is a vivid and even brutal reminder that health is an essential ingredient of a good life.
Thank you for your interventions. I'll try to be brief. Basically, it seems to me our theoretical frameworks have been pervaded by the ideas of Thomas Hobbes. even if we've never read him. Basically, he was saying that we could build peace, prosperity, a functioning state on the basis of eliminating communitarian forms of social organization. And there's another thinker, another philosopher who wrote more than 100 years before Thomas Hobbes, Ibn Khaldun, who was actually trying to answer the very same questions as Thomas Hobbes. He was saying that how can we achieve peace and a flourishing civilization? And he was saying we need to build the state on various forms of communitarian forms of social organization. And we've always followed Hobbes, whereas what I think we should do is give a chance to Ibn Khaldun. So what does that mean concretely? Concretely, we have 2.5 billion people in the world today who are deploying communitarian forms of water tenure and land tenure to steward more than 50% of the world's land. What does that mean? It means that locally, I don't like the word, but local communities, we can discuss what is a community, but local communities have developed land tenure and water tenure, fisheries tenure, forest tenure, as grassroots that was locally made according to their legal is important to their society. So what is tenure? It's the set of interactions and regulations that people develop among themselves, either as collectives or as individuals, whether formal or informal rules to determine how they're going to interact with a resource. What we're facing right now is that under the impulse of the World Bank since 1990, most countries in the world, for example, have been adopting a very similar water law. And this water law systematically says that water is a public property. What we see is that we have these 2.5 billion people who are actually deploying local forms of water tenure and land tenure to manage resources, leading many researchers now to think that 30% to 50% of the water globally is stolen. That's the word you use. Actually, it's very often managed locally by and so we're in a conundrum because we have broadly speaking, we can call them common property regimes over land and water that contribute very heavily to food security at the local level and to biodiversity at the local level. But that is considered water theft by national laws, and it's considered inefficient by our definition of water efficiency and land efficiency. And so what we see is when we have a national investor who's embedded in globalization, or an international investor who comes into a country to develop agriculture and irrigation, for example, they will base themselves on the national water law, which simply ignores, most often completely ignores the local forms of water tenure that are very important for local food security and biodiversity locally. So we have this schizophrenic situation, and some countries now have started trying to recognize local forms of water tenure, and they've tried to integrate them into national legislation. But this is where I think we should start a big discussion, because Mr. De Scutter was concluding on saying that protecting the population can be effective only if it's grounded in human rights. And those forms of land and water tenure that are so important to protect biodiversity and to protect local food security very often are pretty contradictory with human rights. For example, they may consider a spring is the property of a set of families, and another set of families, because they're part of another ethnic group, for example, are excluded from that spring. That is contradictory with human rights. Please don't think I'm trying to argue against human rights. I really like human rights, but that is a conundrum which we need to solve. And there are ways forward, and we need to solve it within international agreements, within the context of multilateralism. If we want to include those people, at Sheila Janssenoff yesterday in her panel, she was referring to the demonstration in Paris when demonstrations were not allowed because of terrorist events shortly before, and shoes had been left to symbolize invisible demonstrators. And she said, what about the people who don't wear shoes? They are not represented there. Well, that's the whole point. How can we include them? It is possible. I've been part of writing a proposal for an Israeli-Palestinian water agreement that was including such local water tenure and formal institutions in a broader institutional framework that would be bilateral between Israel and Palestine. We can do this. This is possible. But first, we have to recognize those forms of land and water tenure. We have to recognize the positive externalities they produce. But we also have to accept that they're not egalitarian, that they very often, they're not very much in agreement with human rights. And we have to negotiate a compromise with them if we want to include them. But that is possible. Now, we did propose this. It was picked up. It was initially as part of the Geneva Initiative that we were asked to write this. It was considered too iconoclastic to be picked up by the Geneva Initiative, but it was picked up by Friends of the Earth Middle East at the time, who promoted a campaign, Water Cannot Wait, promoting this type of agreement. So far, it's still, it hasn't been picked up, but I think we should pursue this discussion, and it's not going to be an easy discussion because those forms, local forms of water and land management, which are used to manage more than 50% of the world, are not very much in agreement with human rights, but they are contributing. We can come back to that in the discussion. I don't want to use up all of the time that's remaining, but they contribute immensely to food security, far more than their production could lead us to believe. Because when you see industrial food production, it's very often intended for a high value product that is aimed for exportation. And what, 30% will end up in a rubbish bin. And so we actually have high efficiency in agriculture and irrigation. We think more water, more crop per drop. But if we rethink water efficiency in the terms of local water and land tenure systems, it's more local equity, more local food security, and more biodiversity per drop that we can see. So I think we need to rethink our definitions of what is efficient resource management. And if we rethink that definition of what is efficient resource management, we can then open a discussion for integrating local forms of tenure with more universal values, basically. I know I haven't used up very much time, but I really would like to hear Mariama. And I see on my clock there's only 7 minutes late. So I wish this panel could last 24 hours, but sadly we don't have 24 hours. So
thank you so much, Julie. And also we didn't take time to introduce you. So maybe just to share with the audience that you're Julie Trottier, Directrice de Recherche at CNRS. And I'm sure we can give Mariana a little bit more time, and we'll do our best with the question time. Maybe just to complement very briefly what you say, and just to mention that from an international level, under the Convention on Biological Diversity and several pieces of work under the Food and Agriculture Organization, we have more and more international recognition of the commons and tenure as a matter actually of international human rights law. But I very much agree with you that even in that effort, maybe we gloss over or we haven't sufficiently addressed the potential tensions with human rights once we look into the particular workings of the commons. And I think that's a really important question for us to explore in the discussion very soon.
And a big problem there very often is we use the legal categories that have already been defined in the national law to recognize the local forms of tenure, which means we distort the categories that have been elaborated locally. And so even we have many examples of trying to integrate, recognize them, that end up fossilizing them, because one of the reasons they're so resilient, these forms of local tenure, is because they keep evolving. They adapt to changing demographics, changing economy, changing climate. And if you recognize them once and for all, then you prevent them from developing further. And very often you recognize them on the grounds of the terms of the national legislation instead of their terms. That's also, I mean, we need to listen to Mariama.
A lot to talk about there, but yes, it feeds into that idea of like how we foster continuous learning as opposed to those one-off approaches. So thank you very much. And Mariama, we're finally back to you. I'm really sorry you had to be interrupted and technology was not on your side, but if you are able to I know you were mid-flow, but
I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm very sorry. I apologize for lengthening the panel. I'm just going to make a few remarks. I fully agree with what I've heard so far from my fellow panelists in terms of the binders and sometimes the conflict between what should be benevolent or beneficial, but which turns out to work at the disadvantage of the marginalized and the vulnerable. I think the multilateral system that's been in place now, which has served certain people and some countries very well, is clearly no longer capacity and enabled to carry the population of the world as needed. It's never really fully addressed the question of indigenous people, of gender, and of the repatriation of the debt owed to Africa, not to mention indigenous people. And I think if we don't start from a base of looking at what has been the consequences and the cause of where we are, and I mean economically, the pandemic notwithstanding, yes, that's an exogenous factor, but that also has a lot to do with how we have treated the planet and how we have exploited and exacerbated the unfolding of dynamics, loss of species, and the interaction between us as species, human species, and other species on the planet. So there are interlinkages there, which I won't go into. But I think at this juncture, what we need to do is we need to rebuild. I think that there is a community of nations, and certainly there's room for rules and order. And it's critical that we recognize that we're in a Kairos moment that demands a different set of leadership, and that must be grounded in and inclusive of the perspective of people who have been alienated and left out from the system. And I think if anything good has come from the pandemic, is that it has shown, as the quotes that I quoted before from Isabel Sawyer and company, it has shown really the glaring gaps and the underlying fissure and fracture in the system. That's a system that we cannot continue to perpetuate. We cannot band-aid it. And I think we need to go back to some fundamental starting point based on equity, inclusiveness, and participation. Now, the multilateral system includes not just peace and security, but it also is the macroeconomic policy that is the framework that drives national policy and local dimensions. And so that the macro policy has to significantly change. Now the macro policy is oriented around, and it's continued to be around even in response to the pandemic, financialization and serving the finance and capital market, and not enough attention to poverty, to inequality, to the fact that health systems in developing countries were decimated during periods of structural adjustment. We're not addressing underlying issues of debt. We have no structural response to debt. We have stopgap measure. Certainly, yes, the IMF temporary measures, and we know that the issuance of SDRs, but even with the SDRs, there was no consideration to how do we reformulate that. If we have $650 billion of SDRs, which is a significant portion of which is going to the developed countries, which have significant capacity already, why was there no need to think about how to put that into a trust fund for health, for gender equality, for all the things that we say we need, for care, so that at the global level, we need to regird the system of and start to think and put them together a working group to look at how we measure the economy. Global GDP is anachronistic. It does not represent the real value of what's going on in the economy and take into account people's life. We do not put care and social reproduction at the base of macroeconomic policy. We do not put the discrimination and healthcare at the base of macroeconomic policy. So I think that whole system change as the flag. In my remaining time, I'll just say we have a number of things that feminists have put on the board that I think are considerations for those who are deliberating about reforming multilateralism. There's the UN Women's Feminist Plan. There's also the recently concluded UNCTAD, where for the first time there was a Gender and Development Forum. In the 50 years of UNCTAD, there was a Gender and Development Forum. And that there's also the Bridgestone Declaration from that, where feminists from all over the world have come together over a period of 6 months and have put together their demands as to what they think the multilateral trade system and the macroeconomic system should look like. So we have the pieces on the board. And I think it's a matter of getting these voices to the table. For too long, the planks of multilateralism has been dominated by the Washington consensus coming from Washington, with no attention to bringing in voices. I think we also need, at this point, not to just rely on economists and other social scientists and financiers. We also need to draw on the wide range of leaderships, both in outside the social sciences. We need to look to traditions of mindfulness and traditions of ecology thinking to bring together, because we have the climate crisis, the environmental crisis, we have the economic inequality crisis, and we have a gender crisis. But a parallel violence against women, the fact that women have been losing in the labor force, and the number of women who are going back into, so we have retrogression from gender equality. 30, 40 years of gender equality progression is gone down. So it just shows that these were never fully really anchored into the system. If we can immediately have policies that are completely gender blind and are completely unclimate friendly in response to a pandemic, without thinking it through. So I think there's a lot of things that need to be done, and I know there are many different institutions that are putting forward proposals for a social contract, the Club of Madrid. There's also G7 has their economic resilience working group. But that working group, I looked at their working group measure, and it's as if the climate justice and gender justice are not part of it. So gender justice, climate justice, and also the whole sense of how do we deal with indigenous people and what has happened in terms of colonialism and the movement of people from Africa. Those things have to undergird the financial system and the economic policy system for us to really move in an inclusive, equitable, and fair and just transition. So just transition is also a critical part. So I just want to throw those on the table. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mariama, also for bearing with all the technical challenges. I think your points around putting center stage care economy and this idea, this kind of more also historical understanding of discrimination as part of multilateral discussions on macroeconomics is really powerful, and hopefully we can expand on that in the discussion. So I understand that we are now ready to open the floor for questions, and hopefully all of us will have a chance to expand on the points that were a bit squeezed into the little time for the presentations. And I think we would like to give the floor first to a couple of students at Sciences Po who may wish to engage with our speakers. I think I have one name of a student who's ready to answer a question, and that's Fiona Harry. Fiona, are you able to take the floor?
Yes, hello, I'm here. I'm also here with Marion, who is going to answer ask the next question. So my question is for Chris Chimby, which is, many of the world's most pressing environmental issues are directly caused by a combination of increasing global population, rapidly increasing middle class, and a change in lifestyles and consumption. Disadvantaged individuals and groups often face disproportionate and negative impacts from such issues. How can this dilemma be resolved where environmental consequences from development ultimately harm the groups it seeks to benefit?
Shall we ask Chris to answer first and then have the second question?
That sounds great, thanks.
Okay, Chris, are you happy?
Yes, I'm not sure if I really get the question. What I pick from there is an apparent assumption that population growth in Africa leads to the problems that we are facing. Is that what you are asking?
Not specifically in the case of Africa, but more just the global population and the shift in diets that we're seeing, and the increased pressure on resources.
Yes, that impact, of course, the increase in population does have an impact on the use and sharing of resources. But that said, that shouldn't be a fact. I mean, the reason I hinged on the question of population quickly is because that, at least from the African point of view, has always been touted as a problem that is causing most of the challenges that Africa faces. But I don't think it's the only problem that that causes the challenges in Africa. But if you view it from a multi-dimensional way, to say there are other reasons that may contribute to the challenges that we are facing, that would provide or cater for more viable solutions. And the reason I say that, and again, it still points for me, when you talk about population growth and impacts on the environment and everything else, from where I sit, normally it then ends up also tending to be linked to the reason why Africans are migrating out of Africa to Europe. That's normally the way the argument will start. And that's why I latched on the issue of population growth. But of course, yes, there's the issue of population growth and having impacts on the natural natural diversity and also biodiversity rather, and populations. But otherwise, I think that shouldn't be an issue that will say we should, I mean, in terms of solutions, sustainability cannot be the solutions to sustainability cannot be limited to reduction in population growth only. I think that's the way I can respond to your question.
Do you have the floor? You want Mary? Would you like to introduce yourself and ask your question?
Yes, thank you so much for presentations. I have a question for Mariama Williams. You argue in a lot of your work for more of a focus on gender equality, on South-South exchanges, and you also point out that there's no clear evidence between growing trade policies and women empowerment. So drawing from that, I was wondering, how can multilateralism overcome the post-colonial trading systems that lock in developing countries in an export-driven economy that often drives the exportation of raw materials to the global north? And if you think that escaping that system will drive more women empowerment. And I have a follow-up question on that, which is that often we have conservative arguments that say that you cannot argue for both sustainability and women empowerment because it's separate topics, and then you have more progressive arguments that call for intersectionality. And I was wondering how you can see that these different agendas of sustainability and women empowerment can be defended together on multilateral agenda without separating really these two causes.
So first I would like to say that I actually do not see a contradiction between sustainability and women's empowerment. I've actually never come across that as in opposition, because I think sustainability is grounded on women's empowerment. I think women all over the world are the caretaker of people and planet. I think if you look at who sustains the economy, as we see clearly from the COVID pandemic, it is the work of women, primarily who are doing social reproduction, and the men who do that, but primarily it's women. It's the women who are the farmers in Africa and in Asia and many places. And if left up to many women, they would be using sustainable technology. Most extension program that brings in pesticides and stuff comes in through development assistance, coming through a whole variety of techniques, and they're geared towards what are presumed to be the male farmer, with very little of that resource going to women. So women are left to actually use their physical labor and the drudgery of work to do that. I think empowerment means moving the resources